The first sign that Daniel Mercer's career was over wasn't the meeting. It was the silence afterward. Not one person looked at him. Not when the presentation ended. Not when Ethan Wolfe accepted congratulations for a project Daniel had nearly killed himself building. Not even when Marianne Vale, the CEO herself, smiled across the conference table and said, "Excellent work, Ethan." Daniel sat frozen in his chair, 32 floors above downtown Chicago, surrounded by executives he'd worked beside for 7 years, and suddenly he felt like a stranger who'd wandered into the wrong room. On the massive screen behind Ethan, the Redbridge Recovery Initiative glowed in polished blue letters. Daniel knew every inch of that project. He'd slept in airport terminals for it, missed his father's surgery consultation for it, spent 14 months holding together a collapsing logistics company after a cyber attack nearly wiped out 40,000 jobs across the Midwest. And now his name was gone. Not minimized. Gone. Gone. Ethan clicked to the next slide like nothing happened. As leadership stabilized operations, he said smoothly, we were able to restore client confidence ahead of schedule. Leadership. Daniel stared at him, because Ethan hadn't even been in the room during the worst months. When systems were failing, when vendors threatened lawsuits, when clients screamed through conference calls at 3 in the morning, Ethan had stayed safely inside headquarters while Daniel carried the disaster on his back. But now, Ethan stood at the front of the room wearing Daniel's success like a tailored suit. And somehow, nobody objected. That was the part Daniel couldn't process. Not immediately. The CFO looked down at her tablet. The legal director adjusted his glasses. A junior vice president nodded along as if the story on screen had always been true. Then, Ethan said something that made Daniel's stomach drop. There were concerns early on about whether Mercer's division could execute at the necessary level. A few quiet laughs circled the table, not loud enough to seem cruel, just soft enough to hurt more. Daniel finally spoke. "Sorry," he said carefully. "What exactly are you saying?" The room tightened instantly. Ethan turned toward him with fake surprise. "Daniel, you just described my division as a problem." "No," Ethan replied calmly. "I said there were concerns." "From who?" Ethan smiled faintly. And that smile told Daniel everything. This wasn't improvisation. This had been rehearsed. Marianne stepped in before Ethan answered. "We all contributed to Redbridge." There it was. Corporate language. Smooth. Clean. Impossible to fight directly. We all contributed. Spot, meaning nobody would ever be accountable for stealing credit because ownership itself had just been diluted into group effort. Daniel looked directly at Marianne. "With respect," he said quietly, "the contracts don't say that." The room went dead silent. Even Ethan stopped moving. For 1 second, Daniel thought Marianne might actually respond honestly. Instead, she folded her hands and said, "This isn't the time." The warning landed immediately. And suddenly, Daniel understood something terrifying. Everyone in that room already knew what was happening. Everyone except him. 3 hours later, his executive access card stopped working. Not the building, just the executive floor. That detail mattered, because whoever planned this wanted humiliation without witnesses. Daniel stood outside the elevator scanner while 2 analysts awkwardly pretended not to notice the flashing red light. He tried again. Denied. One analyst cleared his throat. "Maybe the system's updating?" Daniel nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said. "Maybe." But deep down, something cold had already started settling into place. By Friday, he'd been removed from client calls. By Monday, his assistant stopped forwarding strategic meeting invites. And by Wednesday, his office was gone. Not reassigned. Erased. A facilities employee was already boxing his things when Daniel arrived that morning. The man looked uncomfortable. "I was told you knew." Daniel stood there staring at the framed architecture print his father gave him when he got promoted to executive director. The employee avoided eye contact. "I can come back later if you want." Daniel swallowed hard. "No," he said quietly. "It's fine." But it wasn't fine, because this wasn't restructuring. This was execution. Slow, professional, carefully managed. And the worst part? People adapted unbelievably fast. Coworkers who once begged for Daniel's approval now spoke to him cautiously, like standing too close might damage their own careers. Conversations stopped when he entered rooms. People avoided elevators with him. Even the interns noticed. Especially the interns. One afternoon, Daniel overheard 2 associates whispering near the coffee station. I heard he cracked under pressure. No, apparently legal was already documenting issues. Seriously? Yeah, Ethan basically saved the account. Daniel kept walking. Didn't react. Didn't defend himself. But that night, he sat alone in his apartment, staring at the Chicago skyline with untouched takeout growing cold beside him. And for the first time in years, he genuinely questioned himself. Had he missed something? Was this how people really saw him? That thought followed him for weeks. Because public humiliation does something dangerous. If enough people repeat the same lie long enough, eventually part of you starts wondering whether it's true. Meanwhile, Ethan expanded. Bigger office, more authority, more visibility beside Marianne. Daniel watched him slowly becoming the face of the company Daniel helped build. And every day it got worse. Until one small detail changed everything. It happened almost by accident. Late Thursday night, Daniel was cleaning old project archives off a backup drive when he found an emergency authorization packet from the early Red Bridge crisis. Normally he would have ignored it, but one number caught his attention. A vendor payment. Too large. Daniel frowned and opened another file, then another. His heartbeat slowed, not faster. Slower, because suddenly the pieces started connecting. Emergency subcontractors, insurance reimbursements, duplicate infrastructure invoices buried inside crisis spending. At first glance, it looked messy, but the deeper Daniel dug, the less random it became. This wasn't accounting sloppiness. This was engineered, carefully hidden beneath operational chaos. Daniel leaned back slowly in his chair. Rain tapped against the apartment windows while downtown Chicago glowed through the darkness. And then came the realization that changed everything. They hadn't pushed him out because he failed. They pushed him out because he understood the system better than anyone else, and they were afraid he'd notice what they'd done with it. For the first time in weeks, Daniel smiled. Just slightly, because fear had finally become clarity. The next morning, he returned to work like nothing had changed. That part mattered most. He didn't fight, didn't argue, didn't confront Ethan. Instead, Daniel became quieter, more agreeable. He apologized during meetings, accepted low-level assignments without complaint, even laughed once when Ethan made a dismissive joke about operational over-engineering. And slowly, Ethan relaxed. That was Daniel's first real victory, because arrogant people become careless the moment they think they've won. Over the next 2 months, Daniel rebuilt himself in complete silence. At work, he played the role they created for him. Disgraced executive. Former golden boy. Man quietly fading out of relevance. But at night, he mapped everything. Vendor timelines, authorization chains, internal approvals. The deeper he dug, the uglier it became. Millions had been redirected during the Red Bridge crisis through layered consulting contracts tied to future acquisition structures. Not enough to trigger criminal headlines. That wasn't the goal. This was executive-level fraud. The kind designed to survive audits while enriching the right people before a buyout. And at the center of it all, Ethan Wolf. But Ethan wasn't acting alone. That realization hit Daniel like a punch, because Marianne's signatures were everywhere. The CEO herself protected the structure, which meant this wasn't corruption hidden from leadership. Leadership was the corruption. Daniel sat back in darkness one night, staring at the evidence spread across his dining table. And suddenly another terrifying thought appeared. If they were willing to erase him this thoroughly, what happened when they realized he knew? The answer came faster than expected. 2 weeks later, Linda Cho from finance called him after midnight. She sounded nervous. I shouldn't be doing this. Daniel stayed quiet. People reveal more when silence forces them to continue. Linda exhaled shakily. They're modifying audit trails. Daniel's chest tightened. How? Retroactive approvals. Expense recategorization. Somebody's cleaning records before acquisition review. Daniel closed his eyes. There it was. Confirmation. Then Linda said the sentence that changed the stakes completely. They're preparing to blame you. Silence. Heavy silence. You're sure? I saw your name attached to internal risk memos. Daniel stood and walked toward the window. Below him, headlights streamed through rain-soaked streets like rivers of light. They're setting me up. Yes. Why tell me? Linda hesitated. Because even now, she sounded afraid of being overheard. Because you're the only person there who actually knows how Red Bridge worked. After the call ended, Daniel didn't sleep. He sat in darkness until sunrise, thinking about every meeting, every rumor, every carefully planted humiliation over the past 3 months. And suddenly all of it made sense. They weren't isolating him emotionally. They were isolating him legally. Then came the email. Friday, 7:12 a.m., mandatory meeting with HR. Subject line, organizational realignment discussion. Daniel stared at the screen for a long moment. Most employees panic when they get emails like that. Daniel almost felt relieved, because now he finally knew the timeline. The termination meeting was scheduled for 8:30 Monday morning. Classic corporate strategy. Early enough to remove someone quietly before the week fully started. When Daniel entered the conference room, everything looked perfectly arranged. HR paperwork stacked neatly, water glasses untouched, Marianne sitting at the far end beside legal counsel, Ethan wearing his usual controlled expression, prepared, confident, certain. Paula Simmons from HR began speaking first. As part of ongoing structural evaluation, Daniel raised a hand politely. One question before we start. Marianne's eyes narrowed slightly. What question? Daniel placed a thin black folder onto the conference table. The room changed instantly. Not dramatically, subtly. But Daniel saw it, the flicker in Ethan's expression, the tension in Marianne's shoulders. Even legal counsel leaned forward slightly. Daniel opened the folder. Inside were transaction maps, authorization chains, vendor relationships, every piece meticulously organized. You used emergency procurement exemptions to hide financial layering during Redbridge, Daniel said calmly. Nobody spoke. Ethan recovered first. That's a serious accusation. No, Daniel replied softly. It's a timeline. The silence that followed felt enormous. Daniel looked directly at Marianne. You used my infrastructure because you trusted I wouldn't notice. For the first time in months, Marianne lost composure. Just for a second. But Daniel saw it, and so did legal. That was the moment the balance shifted. Not when Daniel presented evidence. When the lawyers realized the evidence might actually hold up, Ethan leaned forward aggressively. What exactly do you want? That question again. What do you want? As if everyone assumed revenge always came with a price tag. Daniel slid another document across the table. An acquisition risk assessment. Internal. Confidential. Highlighting how executive misconduct exposure could collapse company valuation overnight. Corporate counsel's face changed immediately. Marianne noticed. And suddenly even she looked nervous. Daniel stood slowly. I haven't contacted outside auditors, he said quietly. Then he paused, long enough for the fear to settle in. Yet. Ethan stood up abruptly. You're threatening us. Daniel looked at him for a long moment. No, he said calmly. I'm letting you feel what you spent months making me feel. Then he walked out, and nobody stopped him. That was the moment Ethan Wolfe realized Daniel Mercer had never actually been powerless. He'd just been patient. What happened next nearly tore the company apart. Within days, outside auditors appeared. Meetings vanished from calendars without explanation. Executives stopped speaking openly in hallways. Rumors spread through every department like smoke. And Daniel? Daniel said nothing publicly. That silence terrified them more than outrage ever could. Because silence suggested control. Then came the first visible crack. Olivia Bennett, the company's largest client, she suspended acquisition discussions pending compliance review. The board panicked immediately. Stockholders started asking questions. And suddenly the same executives who ignored Daniel for months were calling him nonstop. He declined every meeting request, especially Ethan's. One voicemail arrived at 11:42 p.m. Daniel listened to it twice. Ethan sounded exhausted. Desperate even. We can fix this professionally. Daniel almost laughed. Professionally. After months of public humiliation, after systematic isolation, after trying to frame him. Now Ethan wanted professionalism. 2 days later, the board summoned Daniel privately. Different conference room, different atmosphere. No smug smiles this time. Only nervous men in expensive suits trying to understand how badly things were about to explode. An older director named Richard Halpern finally asked, "What exactly are you seeking here?" Daniel looked around the room carefully. They expected money. Executives always assumed everyone had a price. Instead, Daniel answered quietly, "I want the truth corrected publicly." The room went still. "I want formal withdrawal of performance allegations. I want acknowledgement of Redbridge leadership responsibility, and I want operational transparency before acquisition." One board member frowned. That's all? Daniel looked directly at him. You expected greed because that's how people like Ethan think. Nobody argued, because deep down, they knew he was right. Richard studied Daniel carefully. You could destroy this company. Daniel nodded once. I could. The room tightened. Then Daniel said something nobody expected. But thousands of employees didn't create this mess. I'm not interested in burning them to punish executives. That answer changed everything, because suddenly the board understood something Ethan never had. Daniel wasn't emotional, he was disciplined. And disciplined people are far more dangerous. 48 hours later, Marianne Vale resigned. Official statement. Personal reasons. Ethan Wolfe was placed on administrative leave pending investigation. And on Monday morning, Harrow and Vale issued a formal correction acknowledging Daniel Mercer's leadership role in the Redbridge Recovery Initiative. Employees across the company read the announcement in stunned silence, because suddenly the whispers changed direction. Now people remembered Daniel differently. Now they remembered who actually carried the company through crisis. And Ethan? People started realizing something terrifying about him, too. He'd never built anything himself. He'd only learned how to stand in front of other people's work. 3 weeks later, Daniel sat alone in a quiet Italian restaurant overlooking the river. For the first time in months, the city felt calm again. Then someone approached his table. Linda Cho. She smiled nervously. Mind if I sit? Daniel nodded. After a moment, she asked quietly, You know what people are saying now? Daniel sipped his wine. Probably a lot of things. They're saying Ethan never understood why people trusted you. Daniel stared out the window for a second. Then he said something Linda would remember for years. He understood. She frowned slightly. Then why attack you? Daniel looked back at her calmly. Because he couldn't create what I built, so he tried to own it instead. Linda went quiet. Then she laughed softly. You know what scared them most? What? You never panicked. Daniel smiled faintly. That part wasn't true. He had panicked. Alone. At night. In silence. But panic becomes dangerous only when other people can use it against you. And Daniel learned a long time ago that survival wasn't about appearing strongest in the room. It was about staying calm long enough to understand the room better than everyone else inside it. Near midnight, his phone buzzed with a final email. A partnership offer from an outside consulting firm. Executive authority. Equity participation. Respect. Not because they pitied him, because they understood his value. Daniel stared at the screen for a long moment before locking the phone again. Across the river, the Harrow and Vale Tower still glowed against the night sky. Somewhere up there, executives were probably still rewriting timelines and protecting reputations. But Daniel was done fighting for rooms full of people who only respected power after they feared losing it. As he stood to leave, his phone vibrated one last time. Unknown number. 3 words. You were right. No name attached. None needed. Daniel slipped the phone into his pocket and stepped into the cold Chicago night while behind him, high above the city, the people who tried to erase him watched their empire quietly collapse under the weight of its own lies.